The ferry, a scarred hull of rusted steel, groaned as it cleaved the slate-gray water. Dean stood on the exposed deck, the salt spray a cold lash across his face, tasting of iodine and distant decay. He watched the mainland recede, a smear of dwindling green swallowed by the encroaching fog, and felt a peculiar blend of dread and relief. This was it. The final severance. No more sympathetic glances, no more hushed tones, no more the suffocating weight of shared sorrow. Just the ocean, the mist, and the stark, uncompromising solitude of the island. His grandfather's inheritance, a final, unlooked-for gesture from a man he barely knew, had arrived at precisely the moment Dean felt himself dissolving. A reclusive cartographer by trade, he was accustomed to solitude, to the quiet precision of lines on paper, but this was different. This was a forced isolation, a retreat from a world that had become too loud, too sharp, too full of ghosts. He clutched the worn leather satchel containing his most essential tools, compass, dividers, a sheaf of blank vellum, the only things that still felt real, still held purpose. He needed a map for this new territory, a way to chart the uncharted ruins of his own life. He was determined to find it here, amidst the desolation. The island emerged from the mist like a forgotten leviathan, its craggy shores rising abruptly from the churning water. A single, rudimentary dock, splintered and barnacle-encrusted, offered the only point of entry. The ferry's engines cut, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of a gull and the sloshing of the waves against the pilings. The boatman, a weathered figure with eyes the color of sea glass, merely grunted as Dean disembarked, pushing a canvas duffel bag and a heavy crate onto the rickety planks. Without another word, the boat reversed course, its stern churning the water to foam, vanishing back into the spectral veil of the fog. Dean was utterly alone. The air hung heavy and damp, tasting of brine and something else, something earthy and ancient, like whetstone and decaying seaweed. A narrow, overgrown track, barely more than a sheep path, snaked its way up from the dock, winding through gnarled, wind-stunted bushes. Even the gulls seemed to have fallen quiet. He hoisted the duffel over one shoulder, the crate heavy in his other hand, and began the climb. The path twisted and turned, ascending a low bluff. Then, through a sudden thinning of the fog, he saw it. The lighthouse keeper's cottage. A squat, stone box, it crouched low to the earth, as if trying to burrow into the island itself, its slate roof stained with moss and lichen. Windows, small and grim, stared out like vacant eyes, some still intact, others boarded over with planks weathered to the color of bone. A thin, skeletal finger of smoke curled from the chimney, a strange anomaly given his solitary arrival. Dean paused, a frown creasing his brow. Had someone been here? Beyond the cottage, a stark, sentinel silhouette pierced the low-hanging cloud, the abandoned lighthouse. Its white paint was long gone, flaked away by decades of salt and wind, leaving a rough, gray stone tower that seemed to bleed into the sky. It exuded an aura of profound dereliction, a monument to forgotten vigilance. Reaching the cottage, Dean dropped his bags onto the damp, packed earth of the yard. The heavy wooden door, pocked and scarred, was latched with a rusted iron bolt. He fumbled with the cold metal key his grandfather's solicitor had provided, the sharp click echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The door groaned inward, releasing a breath of stagnant, musty air that smelled of damp stone, salt, and something subtly organic, like old parchment left too long in a forgotten drawer. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through grimy window panes. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, swirling in the heavy air. Every surface was coated in a fine, silken layer of gray dust. A thick spider web, intricate and abandoned, spanned a corner of the ceiling. Dean ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, feeling the gritty film. This was more than just neglect. It felt like a place that had been left to rot, slowly, deliberately. He set his satchel down, the soft thump barely audible. He found himself holding his breath, listening. For what, he wasn't sure. The settling of old wood? But there was nothing. He moved to the small, grimy window overlooking the sea, wiping away a patch of dust with his sleeve. The fog had thickened, pressing against the glass, making the world outside a smear of gray. The waves crashed somewhere below, a constant, dull roar that was more felt than heard. It was too deep to be the wind, too steady to be the creaking of an old house. It felt subterranean. He tried to rationalize it, a boat passing far out at sea, perhaps, though he hadn't seen or heard one since the ferry left. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the sheer, overwhelming task of making this desolate place habitable. He had come here to escape one kind of haunting. He hoped he hadn't found another. The ferry's final mournful blast echoed across the water, a sound Dean felt more than heard, resonating deep in his chest. He stood on the rocky shingle of the island's only landing, a canvas duffel slung over his shoulder, the salt-laced wind whipping his hair into a tangled mess. The island itself was a study in desolation, a craggy spine of granite shouldering its way out of the churning slate-gray sea, crowned by the stoic, abandoned lighthouse that had once been his grandfather's dominion. The cottage, a squat, stone structure clinging precariously to the cliff face a short distance away, looked less like a refuge and more like a permanent sentinel against the encroaching elements. He spent the first hours simply existing, letting the profound silence of the place seep into his bones, a silence broken only by the shriek of gulls and the relentless churn of the tide. The cottage was cold, damp, and smelled of brine, mildew, and something else, a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place. He methodically unpacked, his movements precise, a cartographer's inherent need for order asserting itself against the wild disarray of his new surroundings. By late afternoon, a thick, milky fog had rolled in, swallowing the horizon and muffling the already distant sounds of the sea. Dean stepped outside, drawn by an inexplicable pull, and made his way to the edge of the cliff. He knew these waters, had studied their charts for years. The tide should be nearing its peak, cresting against the rocks below. Yet, the waterline seemed wrong. It wasn't just lower than expected, it was too low, the exposed rock slick with recent moisture, as if the sea had abruptly receded, then paused, defying the established rhythm of the lunar pull. He frowned, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. An anomaly, perhaps a localized barometric pressure shift, or a strange confluence of currents. Nothing his maps couldn't account for, eventually. As dusk deepened, painting the fog a bruised purple, a new sound began to filter through the swirling mists. It started as a low thrum, indistinguishable from the wind whistling through the cottage's loose panes. But then it shifted, gaining a resonant quality, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. It wasn't the wind, not truly. It was too sustained, too structured. Dean stood by the window, straining to hear, his ear pressed against the cold glass. Was it the sea, perhaps, echoing off a hidden cavern? Or the groan of ancient timbers in the abandoned lighthouse nearby, settling under the relentless pressure of the island's constant gales? He dismissed it as the tricks of an unfamiliar environment, a mind still adjusting to profound solitude. He was tired, that was all. He decided to explore his grandfather's study, a small room at the back of the cottage, filled with the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and aged paper. His grandfather, a man Dean had barely known, had been a meticulous record keeper, a habit Dean had inherited. He hoped to find some old logs, perhaps even tide charts that could explain the day's strange observation. The desk, a hulking oak beast scarred by years of use, was his first target. Its drawers were stiff, resisting his efforts, until one, nestled deep at the bottom, finally gave way with a groan. Beneath a stack of brittle, salt-stained nautical charts, their edges crumbling to the touch, Dean's fingers brushed against something unexpectedly heavy. He pulled it out, a leather-bound journal, its cover swollen and warped, the pages within fused together in places by water damage. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking with a sound like old bones. The initial pages were standard entries, weather observations, ship sightings, maintenance notes for the abandoned lighthouse. But as he turned deeper, the neat cursive handwriting began to unravel, becoming more frantic, the ink bleeding in places as if written in a hurry, or in distress. And then came the sketches. Not the precise drawings of a cartographer, but wild, sprawling depictions that made the hair on Dean's arms stand on end. They were not of ships or storms, but of impossible geometries, swirling patterns that seemed to warp the very page. Tentacles, thick as tree trunks, coiled around these unnatural forms, emerging from vast, unblinking eyes that stared from impossible depths. And beneath one particularly grotesque image, a single phrase was scrawled, repeated over and over, as if to embed itself into the very fabric of the page, the deep song. It calls. It waits. Dean stared, his breath catching in his throat. His grandfather had always been an eccentric, a recluse, but this was beyond mere eccentricity. He traced a finger over a sketch of a creature with too many fins, its form both alien and disturbingly familiar, like something glimpsed in a nightmare. The water damage wasn't just from sea spray, some of the pages looked as if they had been submerged, the ink blurring into murky Rorschach blots. He closed the journal abruptly, the sound a sharp clap in the quiet room. His mind, trained in logic and the precise measurements of the world, struggled to reconcile these images with anything he knew. Hallucinations? Perhaps a form of folk art, strange local myths given form. The deep song was likely just some old sailor's superstition, a poetic term for the ocean's ceaseless roar. Yet, as he looked out the window again, into the thick, swirling fog, the low, resonant hum seemed to intensify, and for the first time, Dean felt a prickle of unease that no map could ever chart. The island, which he had sought for solace, felt suddenly vast and unknowable, its secrets stirring beneath the waves. Dean stared at the journal, the grotesque sketch of the creature still searing itself into his vision. His grandfather's erratic scrawl, once dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, now held a terrifying weight. He had always believed his grandfather simply saw too much in the roiling sea, that solitude had curdled his mind. But this felt different. A cold knot tightened in Dean's stomach. There had to be an explanation, something rooted in the island's history, not just in a descent into madness. He pushed away from the heavy oak desk, the chair scraping a protest against the floorboards. The cottage was silent save for the distant moan of the foghorn from the abandoned lighthouse and the ceaseless whisper of the waves against the shore. Dean walked to the small, dusty bookcase tucked into a corner of the living room. Among the worn nautical charts and forgotten fiction, he found a few local history texts, their spines cracked and faded. He pulled out a slim volume titled Eldoria, A History of the Outer Isles, and another, more brittle one, Coastal Folklore and the Deep. He settled back at the desk, spreading the books open beside his laptop. The journal lay open too, its cryptic entries a puzzle he was determined to solve. He began with the island's recorded past, sifting through accounts of early settlers, fishing hauls, and the occasional shipwreck. Nothing truly remarkable. Then, in Coastal Folklore, he found it, a chapter dedicated to the legends of Eldoria. Fishermen's tales, the author dismissed them, born from too much rum and too many lonely nights at sea. But Dean felt a prickle of unease. The descriptions, vague as they were, echoed the unsettling forms in his grandfather's sketches, the impossible angles, the sense of vastness. The book mentioned rites, too, performed by the island's earliest inhabitants, crude ceremonies meant to appease the deep dweller, to ensure safe passage and bountiful catches. A pact, the legends implied, forged in the primordial gloom. He turned back to the journal, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, frantic lines. Now, armed with this sliver of context, a few phrases began to coalesce. The old ones stir, one entry read, followed by the bargain upheld. Another, more recent, lamented, the price grows steep. His grandfather hadn't been imagining things, he had been documenting them. They were observations. He worked into the small hours, the lamp casting a sickly yellow glow over the desk. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and the rhythmic groan of the abandoned lighthouse's horn seemed to deepen, vibrating through the very foundation of the cottage. Dean's eyelids grew heavy, but his mind raced. The more he read, the more threads he found connecting the ancient legends to his grandfather's increasingly desperate notes. A pact. A demanding entity. A sunken city. It was too specific, too consistent to be pure coincidence. He felt a growing resolve, a determined push against the tide of doubt and fear. He needed to understand. Sleep, when it finally claimed him, was not a refuge. It wasn't sound, not truly, but a vibration, a sensation that spoke of something alien and utterly indifferent. His chest tightened, a panic he couldn't vocalize clawing at his throat. He tried to scream, but only a silent stream of bubbles escaped his lips. The pull intensified, growing stronger, more insistent, and he knew, with a certainty that pierced his dream state, that whatever held him would not let go. He woke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He blinked, trying to clear the lingering fog of the dream, his breath ragged. He pushed himself up, his muscles aching, and stumbled towards the light. On the sill, clinging to the weathered wood, was a patch of something iridescent, pulsing with a faint, greenish-blue luminescence. It looked like algae, but unlike any he had ever seen. Its tendrils seemed to spread, almost imperceptibly, across the sill and down the wall beneath it, a delicate, glowing filigree. He reached out a trembling finger, hesitating just inches from its surface. It was cool, almost gelatinous, and emitted a faint, briny odor, like seawater left too long in the sun. He stared at it, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. How had it gotten inside? The windows had been sealed shut. And then he saw it, another patch, smaller, but undeniably present, clinging to the edge of the old porcelain sink in the corner of the room. And then another, a tiny, glowing speck on the leg of his grandfather's desk. The bioluminescent growth wasn't just outside, a natural phenomenon of the island. The ancient entity, the sunken city, the pact, it wasn't just a legend, or a madman's ramblings. It was here, now, seeping into his reality, claiming territory, silently, relentlessly. The island wasn't just remote, it was alive with something ancient, something that was beginning to reach for him. Dean gripped the journal, the slick chill of its leather binding a stark counterpoint to the heat rising in his face. His grandfather's frantic sketches, once dismissed as the ramblings of a mind adrift in solitude, now resonated with a horrifying conviction. He had believed the old man merely saw too much in the roiling sea, that the isolation had warped his perceptions. Now, a cold, unyielding certainty began to set in. His grandfather had seen something real. Something ancient. Something that had not vanished with the old man's passing. He pushed away from the table, the wooden legs scraping a harsh protest across the floorboards. The familiar scent of salt and damp stone, once comforting, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or stagnant brine. It was a deep, resonant thrum, not a vibration in the air, but a pressure against his eardrums, a bass note that seemed to originate from beneath the very floorboards, from the bedrock of the island itself. He stopped by the small window, peering out into the thick, gray shroud of the fog. He watched a single pebble, dislodged by nothing he could discern, roll slowly from the windowsill and drop to the floor with a tiny click. But then, a moment later, a small, polished brass compass, A relic from his grandfather's collection that had always sat precisely in the center of the mantelpiece, lay skewed at an odd angle, its needle quivering wildly, pointing not north, but straight down towards the hearth. A shiver traced its way up Dean's spine. He walked over, his eyes fixed on the compass. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal. As he did, he caught his reflection in the small, smudged pane of glass above the mantel. For a fleeting instant, his own face seemed to ripple, distort, like an image viewed through disturbed water. His eyes elongated, his jawline blurred, and the contours of his skull seemed to shift, becoming something less human, more fluid. He blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his own pale, startled visage staring back. He rubbed his eyes, a tremor running through his hand. But the hum intensified, growing from a deep thrum into a low, hypnotic chorus, a sound that seemed to resonate within his bones. It was a wordless chant, a mournful, drawing call that pulled at the edges of his concentration. His grandfather's journal had pointed to the sea, to the thing beneath. He grabbed his oilskin coat and lantern, the beam cutting a weak swathe through the pervasive gloom outside. The wind, a biting whip, threatened to tear the light from his hand as he trudged the familiar, winding path towards the abandoned lighthouse. Each step was heavy, each breath shallow, the hypnotic hum seemingly emanating from the very stones beneath his feet. The massive iron door, rusted solid on its hinges, gave way with a screech that echoed like a dying cry when he put his shoulder to it. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brine, guano, and something else, something ancient and metallic, like weathered copper and dried seaweed. The spiraling staircase, a dizzying ascent of worn iron, seemed to stretch into infinity, each step groaning under his weight. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes long shattered, leaving the space exposed to the elements. Here, the hum was deafening, a chorus of unseen voices, though no actual sound escaped his lips. His grandfather's final stand, Dean realized. He swept the lantern's beam across the dusty, salt-crusted walls. What he found made his stomach clench. Scrawled directly onto the stone, beneath layers of grime and salt, were more crude drawings, echoing the journal's grotesque sketch, but larger, more frantic. A few corroded, barnacle-encrusted metal hooks were hammered into the walls, and from one, a single, calcified bone, impossibly old, hung suspended, swaying almost imperceptibly in the constant draft. His grandfather hadn't just observed, he had fought. Or, perhaps, he had bargained. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through Dean. These weren't just warding symbols, some of them looked like offerings, like desperate appeasements. Suddenly, the hum intensified, shifting in pitch, becoming a piercing, resonant shriek that tore through the air. Dean stumbled back, clutching his head, his lantern clattering to the floor. The beam, now askew, danced madly across the fractured glass and ancient carvings. In the periphery of the light, at the very edge of the shattered lantern opening, where the sea spray misted in, a form began to coalesce. It had no discernible features, no eyes or limbs, yet Dean felt an undeniable, predatory intelligence fixated on him. It pulsed, contracting and expanding, its edges blurring into the salty air, and the hum, now a roaring cacophony, seemed to emanate directly from its shifting mass. With a choked cry, Dean lunged, not for the form, but for the iron railing of the staircase, his fingers scrambling for purchase. He had believed the old man merely saw things, that the isolation had frayed his mind. Now, a cold understanding settled in Dean's stomach, colder than the sea spray outside. The grandfather hadn't just seen it, he had fought it. The handwriting, usually precise, had devolved into a desperate scrawl. Dean leaned closer, tracing the words with a trembling finger, but not merely a watcher. The pact demands more. The song, it calls, ever louder. Must perform the rites. The binding is weakening. If I fail, it will rise. The sacrifice. Sacrifice? What did that mean? He scanned further, piecing together fragmented sentences, names of ancient, forgotten ceremonies. His grandfather hadn't been a victim of delusion, he had been a warden. He hadn't just observed the encroaching entity, he had actively engaged in a desperate, solitary war, performing rituals within the abandoned lighthouse to keep the deep song from consuming everything. His grandfather had been a guardian, bound by some horrific, generational agreement. And now, that burden, unacknowledged and terrifying, had fallen to him. It wasn't a sound from outside, not the wind or the waves. This was deeper, resonant, a pressure behind his eyes. The deep song. It had been a distant thrum before, a subtle current beneath the world's surface. The air in the room thickened, tasted metallic, like copper in brine. Images flickered at the edge of his vision, not clear pictures, but fleeting impressions of vast, inky depths, of colossal shapes moving with slow, deliberate power. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. The journal. His grandfather's words had mentioned the rites, the binding. And a specific location the chamber below the light, where the heart of the pact still beats. The abandoned lighthouse. Driven by a desperate need for answers, for confirmation that he wasn't simply unraveling, Dean snatched up the lamp. Its feeble glow barely pierced the encroaching gloom. The deep song was a physical presence now, a crushing weight in the air. The lighthouse stood stark against the bruised twilight sky, its towering structure a silent sentinel to untold horrors. He pushed open the heavy iron door at its base. The interior was a spiral of rusted metal and crumbling stone, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The hum here was deafening, vibrating through his teeth, making his vision swim. He clutched the journal, its leather slick with sweat. His grandfather's frantic sketches of geometric patterns, of symbols that seemed to writhe on the page, now held a terrifying new significance. He scanned the base of the lighthouse, searching for any anomaly. The light from his lamp danced over the rough-hewn stones, revealing nothing but grime and salt-encrusted surfaces. But then, a faint line caught his eye, almost invisible beneath layers of dust and time. It wasn't a natural seam in the rock. He knelt, scraping away the grit with his fingernails. A thin, almost imperceptible gap, tracing a perfect rectangle in the floor. His heart leaped into his throat, a frantic bird against his ribs. He pressed his ear to the cold stone, and the deep song roared in his mind, louder than ever, as if directly beneath him. He pushed against the outline, feeling for a latch, a handle, anything. With a grunt, he pulled. A groan of ancient metal echoed through the tower as a section of the floor, heavy with forgotten weight, began to rise. The deep song throbbed from its depths, a siren call promising oblivion. Dean peered into the blackness, his lamp casting only a shallow pool of light onto the first few steps of a crude, spiraling staircase carved from the living rock. The hidden chamber. The crypt. He had found it. And whatever lay within, whatever ritual his grandfather had performed, awaited him now. Dean stumbled out of the cottage, the lamp's unsteady flame flickering wildly, a small, defiant beacon against the encroaching night. He felt its low thrum resonate in his teeth, a sound that spoke of unimaginable depths and ancient, patient hunger. The fog, thick and damp, clung to him like a shroud, obscuring the path to the abandoned lighthouse even though he knew it by heart. Every gust of wind carried the brine of the sea and something else, a cold, mineral scent, like wet stone and forgotten things. He pushed through the clinging mist, his breath ragged, the beam of the lamp cutting a narrow, wavering tunnel ahead. The lighthouse loomed, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its weathered stone slick with damp. The heavy door, long since warped and swollen, groaned in protest as he forced it open, the sound echoing hollowly up the spiral stairs. He ascended, his hand scraping against the rough, cold stone of the inner wall, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own. The higher he climbed, the more insistent the deep song became, not louder, but more insidious, worming its way into the quiet spaces of his mind. It promised release, oblivion, emerging with something vast and timeless. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes shattered years ago, letting in the damp, salt-laced wind. But this wasn't what he sought. His grandfather's journal had hinted at something deeper, something beneath the tower itself. He swept the lamp's beam across the floor, the walls, searching. The stone was old, uneven, scarred by time and sea air. He ran his hand along the inner curvature, feeling for any irregularity. His fingers brushed against a section that felt subtly different, a seam in the rough-hewn blocks. He pressed, pushed, ran his hand over it again. There. A faint line, almost imperceptible. He found a small indentation, just above the floor, obscured by years of grime. He pushed hard, leaning his weight into it. With a low, grinding rumble that vibrated through the very foundation of the tower, a section of the wall swung inward. He recoiled, coughing, but his determination held. He peered into the newly revealed passage. It was a narrow, unlit tunnel, descending sharply into the earth. The deep song intensified, no longer a distant thrum, but a resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots, up his spine, directly into his skull. The walls were wet, slimy to the touch, and he could hear the faint, rhythmic drip of water somewhere far below. The tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space, a natural chamber carved deep within the island's bedrock. Dean took a shaky breath, the air here heavy and still, like a mausoleum. His eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. In the center of the chamber, a faint, pulsing light emanated from what appeared to be an ancient, obsidian-like monolith. It was taller than Dean, rough-hewn, yet perfectly smooth in places, as if polished by eons of unseen forces. The light within it was not a glow, but a slow, internal throb, a deep, bruised violet, that pulsed with the same rhythm as the deep song. Strange, intricate carvings, too alien to be human, snaked across its surface, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure as he watched. He reached out a trembling hand, drawn by an irresistible pull. Images flooded his mind, overwhelming his senses, stealing his breath. He saw the island, not as it was, but as it would be, swallowed by an unnatural tide, the waves black and viscous, lapping at the highest peaks. It was not a vision of death, but of utter, complete absorption, of his consciousness being stretched thin, dispersed into an ancient, boundless awareness, losing all sense of self. He was a drop of ink in an infinite, lightless ocean. The cosmic nature of the entity wasn't about stars or distant galaxies, but about a primordial, unfathomable existence that predated light, predated form, a consciousness that had slumbered in the deepest trenches of the world since before time had meaning. Its awakening wasn't an act of malice, but a slow, inexorable stirring, a hunger born of eons of dormancy, and the island, the world, Dean himself, were merely incidental nourishment. The entity was real. It was ancient. And it was coming for him, for everything. There was no escape. Not truly. He stumbled from the cottage, not seeking escape, but a different kind of air, a moment's reprieve from the suffocating pressure building within its walls. The night was a canvas of impenetrable black, the fog a living shroud that swallowed the faint light from his unsteady lamp, rendering it a mocking pinprick. This wasn't just sound, it was a physical presence, an intrusion, a cold, wet tendril wrapping around his sanity. He couldn't stay in the cottage. The thought was a raw, undeniable scream in his mind. He needed to move, to find somewhere, anywhere, that might offer a moment of clarity, a place where the grandfather's cryptic notes might finally coalesce into a solution. Towards the abandoned lighthouse. The structure loomed, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its glassless lantern room a vacant eye socket. The iron door groaned in protest as he forced it open, a sound that grated on his teeth. He ascended, the lamp's beam struggling against the pervasive gloom. The winding climb was a physical ordeal, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming, but the internal pressure was worse. It felt as if a colossal hand was pressing against the inside of his skull, pushing outwards, trying to pry open the delicate architecture of his mind. He reached the lantern room, a circular chamber where the wind howled through missing panes, carrying with it the icy spray of the churning ocean. This wasn't just an entity trying to influence him, it was actively trying to breach. He felt it scratching at the inside of his consciousness, a monstrous claw seeking purchase, trying to tear open the fragile membrane that separated his self from it. A crude diagram of the lighthouse, with a small, circled X near the lantern room. A final resort. He had brought the journal, clutched in a desperate grip, its worn leather cover slick with sweat. His fingers, trembling violently, flipped through the brittle pages, past the meticulous navigational charts, the weather observations, the increasingly frantic, illegible scrawls. He found it near the end, a section he had dismissed as the ramblings of a man losing his grip. The script was spidery, almost frantic, unlike the grandfather's usual precise hand. It described a binding, a sealing. The gate is not truly closed, the entry read, only dormant. The pact holds it, but the price must be renewed. A vessel, a conduit. Not of blood, but of self. To sever the connection, to deny the return. Absorption. Dean's breath hitched. Absorption? He scanned the page frantically, his eyes darting across the faded ink. To deny its hunger, one must offer the core of what it seeks. The core of what it seeks. His mind reeled. It sought consciousness, it sought reality, it sought him. The sacrifice wasn't merely a physical act, it was a profound, irreversible surrender. To seal the gate, to truly extinguish the beacon, he would have to offer himself, not as a victim, but as a permanent, living part of the seal. The deep song intensified, now a hungry, triumphant wail. It knew. He was trapped. The words from his grandfather's journal clawed at Dean's mind, each syllable a fresh laceration. Consciousness, reality, him. The entity wasn't a beast seeking flesh, not merely a force of nature. He understood now, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that the beacon wasn't just the lighthouse lamp, but a point of pure, focused awareness. His own. Outside the cottage, the world had begun to unravel. The air thrummed with a low, resonant hum, a sound that vibrated not just in his ears but in his very bones. It felt like the island itself was a vast, straining drumhead, taut and quivering under an invisible mallet. Fog, a constant companion, had thickened into an impenetrable, roiling wall, pressing against the windows like a vast, unseen beast. It wasn't the familiar, comforting mist of the sea, this was a living, breathing shroud, its tendrils reaching, probing. A sickening, sweet stench, like decay mixed with brine and something metallic, began to seep through the cottage's old timbers. He pressed a hand to his temple, trying to push back the psychic static that buzzed at the edges of his thoughts, a thousand whispers vying for attention, promising oblivion, offering peace and surrender. He walked to the window, peering into the swirling gray. What he saw made his breath catch. The familiar silhouette of the crags outside the cottage, usually stark and jagged, now seemed softened, blurred, as if the rock itself was melting. He blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks, but the distortion remained, growing more pronounced with each passing moment. The very ground beneath his feet felt wrong, subtly shifting, a deep, unsettling tremor that had nothing to do with geology. He had lost so much already. He wouldn't let this ancient hunger consume what little remained of his world, of his sanity. The journal lay open on the table, its final pages brittle and stained. He began to gather the items his grandfather had meticulously listed. A small, tarnished silver locket, containing a faded miniature portrait of a young woman, his grandmother. A coil of rope, made from dried sea grasses and knotted with intricate, forgotten patterns. And finally, a heavy, unlit lantern, its glass grimy, its wick dry. Each item felt imbued with a strange, latent power, humming faintly under his touch. His hands trembled, but his movements were precise, driven by a grim necessity. The air in the cottage grew heavier, cloying, as if the oxygen was being slowly drawn out. He could hear the ocean now, not just the crash of waves, but a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from beneath the water, a hungry sound. The wind outside shrieked, a banshee wail that tore at the cottage, rattling the window panes violently. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. The entity was gathering its strength, its tendrils extending from the deep, reaching for the surface, reaching for him. Clutching the lantern and the small satchel of items, Dean pushed open the heavy cottage door. The gale hit him like a physical blow, tearing at his clothes, trying to rip the satchel from his grasp. The fog was a tangible entity now, swirling with such density that he could barely see his outstretched hand. But through the maelstrom, a faint, flickering light beckoned, the single, pale beam of the abandoned lighthouse. It was a ghost light, a remnant of its former purpose, now merely a lure. The path to the lighthouse, usually a familiar, winding track, was a nightmare of shifting ground and unseen obstacles. He stumbled over gnarled roots that seemed to have erupted from the earth overnight, roots that pulsed faintly with an eerie bioluminescence. Every step was a battle against the wind, against the pressing, psychic weight that sought to crush his will. It wanted him to break, to surrender willingly. Finally, he reached the base of the abandoned lighthouse. The iron door, usually stiff, groaned open with an unnatural ease, as if anticipating his arrival. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, salt, and that same sickening sweetness. The spiral staircase stretched upwards into the blackness, a dizzying ascent into the maw of his fate. He could feel the vibrations of the island through the very stone of the tower, the low hum intensifying, resonating with the frantic beat of his own heart. He knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that the true horror awaited him at the summit. The cost would be everything. It hungered for essence, for the very fabric of existence, and to sate it, to seal. The rupture, Dima. Dean had filled in the blank himself, a chilling certainty blooming in his chest, demands sacrifice. He stood on the uppermost landing of the abandoned lighthouse, the wind a shrieking banshee against the rusted lantern room. Below, the iron stairs spiraled into a gaping maw of shadow, each step groaning under his weight, a lament for the years of neglect. The beam, long dead, pointed a broken finger at the roiling, ink-black sea, where the storm had reached its fever pitch. Waves, the size of houses, hammered the cliff face, sending plumes of spray high above the tower. His hands, raw and trembling, clutched the tattered journal and a heavy, tarnished brass compass he'd found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage. The compass needle, usually a jittery sentinel, spun wildly, then locked, pointing straight down, into the depths. This was it. The nexus. The rupture. A low thrum vibrated through the iron structure, not from the wind, but from beneath. It started as a tremor in his teeth, then resonated in his bones, a deep, resonant hum that spoke of immense, ancient power. The very air around him began to shimmer, distorting the glass panes of the lantern room into liquid mirrors. Dean pressed his palm against the cold metal casing, trying to ground himself, but the thrum intensified, becoming a monstrous heartbeat. They spoke of vastness, of endless pressure, of time unspooled into meaninglessness. His own memories, fragments of his past, flashed before him, the scent of his grandfather's pipe tobacco, the smooth curve of a drafting compass, the devastating quiet of an empty room. The entity was probing, tasting, seeking purchase. He fought against the psychic intrusion, clenching his jaw, focusing on the ritual. The journal had been vague, cryptic, but the underlying message was clear: a pact made, a balance upset, a price to be paid. And the entity craved essence. Consciousness. Reality. With a grunt, Dean forced himself to move, pulling a small, heavy iron brazier from his pack. It was a replica of one depicted in the journal, a crude, forgotten tool. He placed it carefully in the center of the lantern room. The compass, still pointing down, pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. As he fumbled for the dried herbs and sea salt he'd gathered, the pressure in the room became unbearable. The glass panes rattled violently, threatening to shatter. Outside, the ocean roared a challenge, but Dean knew the true sound was coming from within. The thrumming escalated into a deafening roar, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his skull, threatening to split it open. The entity was manifesting. The very air grew heavy, viscous, like breathing underwater. He saw them then, or rather, felt them, eyes. He poured the sea salt into the brazier, its granules catching the warped light like tiny, dying stars. He added the dried kelp and unfamiliar, brittle herbs, igniting them with a sputtering match. A plume of bitter, briny smoke rose, momentarily pushing back the encroaching distortion, but it was a fleeting reprieve. The entity lashed out. A wave of pure, concentrated despair washed over Dean, threatening to drown him. He saw his own life laid bare, every regret, every sorrow amplified, twisted into an unbearable burden. He saw himself adrift, alone, unloved, his cartography a futile attempt to map a world that was meaningless. Let go. Become part of the vastness. The brazier teetered, threatening to spill its contents. He knew what it wanted. His consciousness. His reality. His self. The thing that made him Dean. The journal had implied a sacrifice of essence, a piece of himself to mend the rupture, to placate the hunger. He looked at the compass, its sickly green light pulsing faster, like a dying heart. He remembered his grandfather's words about the island, about the pact. He had sought solitude, a fresh start, but found a terrible purpose instead. With a guttural cry, Dean lifted the heavy brass compass. It was a tool of navigation, of mapping, of defining. Reality. And it was imbued, he now understood, with a fragment of his grandfather's own will, his own sacrifice. "You want essence?" Dean roared, his voice cracking, but echoing with a newfound resolve. "You want reality? Take it." He brought the compass down with all his might onto the brazier, aiming for the heart of the smoldering herbs. The brass shattered, fragments skittering across the floor. A blinding flash of green light erupted, followed by a concussive force that threw Dean across the room, slamming his head against the iron railing. The light, the distortion, the impossible eyes, they recoiled. The monstrous roar softened, twisting into a frustrated, dying shriek. Dean lay there, gasping, his head throbbing, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. He felt a vast emptiness had opened within him, a space where his grief, his memories of loss, his very sense of self, had once resided. They were gone, consumed, offered. The entity had taken its payment. The thrumming faded, replaced by the persistent, unyielding roar of the storm. The rupture was sealing. He had paid the price. But at what cost? The world was a fractured mosaic of pain and ringing silence. Dean pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, each twitch sending a fresh wave of agony through his skull. The cold, gritty stone of the abandoned lighthouse floor scraped against his cheek as he shifted. He must have hit his head hard. The air still hung heavy with the acrid scent of burnt herbs and something sharper, like ozone after a lightning strike, or the tang of raw metal. His ears throbbed, a dull echo of the concussive force that had thrown him. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to make sense of the fragmented images warring for dominance in his mind, the blinding flash of green, the sickening lurch, the impact. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes again. The lantern, miraculously, had not shattered, though it lay on its side, casting a feeble, flickering glow across the room. Its light danced over the wreckage of the brazier. What remained was a blackened, distorted mess of metal, the clay pot within it cracked and crumbled. And the compass. He saw it, or what was left of it, gleaming faintly amidst the debris. A mangled piece of brass, its glass face shattered, its intricate needle bent into an impossible, broken angle. It was inert, useless, a relic of a desperate act. But the deep song. Was it gone? Dean listened. He strained his ears past the persistent thrumming in his own head, past the distant, mournful cry of the gulls and the ceaseless roar of the ocean against the island's cliffs. Nothing. He pushed himself to his knees, crawling towards the shattered brazier, his hand shaking as he reached for a fragment of the broken compass. The immediate, aggressive threat, the encroaching pressure that had threatened to tear his sanity apart, seemed to have receded. The raw, hungry presence that had filled the abandoned lighthouse was no longer there, at least not in the same way. A tremor ran through him, a mix of relief and a deeper, more unsettling fear. He had done it. He had shattered the conduit, broken the pact, severed the connection. But then, as he stood, swaying slightly, a subtle shift occurred. It wasn't an external sound, or a sensation of touch, or even a visual distortion. It was internal. He closed his eyes, desperate to shut it out, but it was useless. It was the deep song, not banished, but absorbed. The compass had been a tool to find it, to understand it, and in its destruction, it had etched the very essence of the entity onto his consciousness. He opened his eyes, staring at the ruined brazier, then out towards the sea through the grimy window of the abandoned lighthouse. The fog, ever present, seemed to writhe with a newfound sentience, no longer just obscuring the world but hinting at the endless, unseen currents beneath. He was no longer a reclusive cartographer, mapping the known world. He was a living conduit, a reluctant chart of the unknown, forever tethered to the deep song. It didn't demand his physical presence on the island anymore. It had found a new, more intimate anchor. He had to get away from the island, from the abandoned lighthouse, from the constant, gnawing presence he had invited into his mind. He stumbled out into the pre-dawn gloom, the familiar path to his cottage feeling alien beneath his feet. The boat journey back to the mainland was a blur of nausea and a desperate attempt to drown out the internal hum with the roar of the engine. Days later, miles from the coast, Dean sat hunched over a new map, not of land, but of an imagined topography of the deep. His hands, still bearing faint scars from the compass shards, moved with a strange, compulsive precision. It no longer screamed for his attention, but it was always there, an undercurrent to every thought, every sensation. His sanity, though outwardly intact, felt like a brittle glass, vibrating on the edge of shattering. He was a cartographer of a new, terrible domain, forever listening to the ancient, unknowable song of the deep, its melody echoing not from distant waters, but from the very core of his fractured self.